It's the spring of 1185 BC in the city of Ugarit on the coast of what we now call Syria. King Ammurapi sits in his palace with a letter in front of him. It's a plea for help addressed to his last ally across the sea, and it could bring the ships and soldiers he needs to save his city. But before any help can reach him, that letter has to cross the water and come back with a fleet, and there is no time left. Out on the coast, enemy ships are already burning his towns one by one, 7 of them. His army is hundreds of miles to the north. His war fleet is hundreds of miles to the west. Both were sent away to fight someone else's war, and neither can get back. Around him, a kingdom that has stood for centuries is collapsing in a matter of days. And as the king presses his words into the wet clay, he already knows the one thing he can't bring himself to say out loud: no one is coming. To understand what's burning, you have to understand what Ugarit was, because it wasn't a backwater. For 300 years, it had been one of the richest places on earth. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean around 1300 BC, 100 years before the fire. It is crowded with great powers, and they are all talking to each other. Egypt under the pharaohs, the Hittite Empire up in Anatolia, Babylon, Assyria, the Mycenaean Greeks across the water, Cyprus, which they called Al-Ashia. These kingdoms wrote to each other constantly. Treaties, marriages, complaints, gifts of gold and horses and glass. They called each other brother. It was the first age of international diplomacy, and it ran on a metal, bronze. That's the whole game. Bronze is what you make weapons from, and tools, and armor, and bronze is an alloy, copper mixed with tin. The trouble is that copper and tin almost never come out of the same ground. The tin might be mined 1,000 miles from the copper. To make a single sword, you needed 2 metals from 2 ends of the known world to travel by ship and donkey and meet in the same furnace. That meant trade wasn't a luxury. It was the thing holding the whole civilization together. Cut the routes and the swords stopped. Cut the swords and everything stopped. And Ugarit sat right in the middle of it, a deep harbor on the Syrian coast, the doorway where ships from the sea met the caravan roads going inland to the great empires. Everything passed through: copper from Cyprus, tin from the east, grain, wine, oil, timber, purple dye, ivory. The kings of Ugarit grew fat on the toll of the world moving through their port. We even know what that trade looked like up close because one of those ships never made it. Off the coast of southern Turkey, divers found a merchant vessel that had gone down around 100 years before Ugarit fell, its cargo still sitting on the seabed where it sank. On board was a whole world in miniature, about 10 tons of copper stacked in flat ingots shaped like ox hides, a ton of tin to go with it, the exact recipe for bronze, riding together in the same hull, blue glass, ebony out of Africa, elephant and hippo ivory, jars of resin, beads, gold, weapons, tools, goods from at least 7 different cultures, all in one boat, all moving at once. That single wreck is a photograph of the age, a world stitched together by ships exactly like the ones that would one day come burning along Ugarit's coast. They were so busy that they did something almost no one else had done. They wrote everything down in a brand new way. Most of the world at the time wrote in cuneiform, hundreds of wedge-shaped signs, each one a syllable, a system so hard that only trained scribes could read it. The people of Ugarit took that system and stripped it down to 30 signs. 30, one sign for each sound. They built one of the first alphabets the world had ever seen, and they pressed it into clay, and they used it to keep their accounts. Hold on to that. The alphabet. We'll come back to it. It matters more than anything else in this story, and almost no one in Ugarit would have guessed why. So that's the city, wealthy, connected, clever, sitting at the crossroads of every power that mattered, the kind of place that feels permanent to the people living in it. It was not permanent, and the cracks had already started. The first thing to go wrong was the weather. Across the Eastern Mediterranean, in the decades before the fire, the rains began to fail. We can see it now in pollen samples and dried lake beds and the rings of old trees, a long grinding drought that settled over the whole region. Harvest shrank, and in a world this connected, one kingdom's famine became everyone's emergency. The letters from those years are full of hunger. They survive, baked in clay, and you can still read them. The Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the age, was starving, and its king wrote to Ugarit begging for grain to be shipped north. One message calls it a matter of life and death. Another demands a ship and crew to carry food fast because people are dying. Sit with the strangeness of that. The Hittites had armies that fought Egypt to a standstill, and here they are, riding to a port city, pleading for food like a matter of life and death. The most powerful people in the world had stopped worrying about glory. They were worried worried about eating. Ugarit, for a while, was the one passing out the bread. It shipped grain to the starving and kept the system limping along. And then Ugarit ran out too. There's a quiet horror in that turn. The city that fed its neighbors started to go hungry itself. The bread basket emptied, and once the food was gone, everything that the food had been holding up began to wobble. The trade, the loyalty, the trust between kingdoms that had called each other brother for 300 years. These letters sat in the ground for over 3,000 years before anyone read them. The people who wrote them had no idea we ever would. If the way I move through these old, buried stories is something you want more of, the subscribe button is how I find my way back to you. That's all. Let's go back to the coast. By the time the king is pressing his words into that wet clay, the world Ugarit depended on is already coming apart at the edges, and Ammurapi is about to make the decisions that leave his city naked. His name was Ammurapi, the last king Ugarit would ever have, though of course he didn't know that. Ammurapi had a problem that came with being rich and small in a world of giants. Ugarit wasn't independent. It was a vassal, a junior partner of the Hittite Empire to the north, and when your overlord is starving and frightened and at war, your overlord makes demands. So the demands came. Send your army north to fight for us. Send your warships west to patrol the coast against raiders. And Ammurapi, who could not say no to the empire that towered over him, did as he was told. His soldiers marched off into the land of the Hittites. His fleet sailed off to a region the letters call Lucca, on the southern coast of what's now Turkey. The wealth of Ugarit had bought it the finest navy on that stretch of sea. And on the day it was needed most, that navy was somewhere over the horizon, guarding someone else's water. The city was left with its walls, its harbor, and almost nobody to hold either. Then the warning came. A letter arrived from Cyprus, from the king of Al-Ashia, or his senior official, depending on how you read it. The message was a warning and a question at the same time. Enemy ships had been seen, and the official wanted to know urgently, where were Ugarit's own forces? Where was the enemy fleet now? It reads like a man leaning across a table, gripping your arm. Tell me where everyone is. Tell me right now. We have Ammurapi's reply. It's one of the most haunting documents to survive from the ancient world, and it's worth letting him speak for himself because no narrator could put it better than a cornered king did 3,000 years ago. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. The country is abandoned to itself. He knew. That's the thing that stays with you. He wasn't blindsided. He sat in his palace and wrote down in plain words the exact shape of the trap. The enemy is here. My army is in one place, my navy in another, both of them too far to matter, and there is no one left. Then he added the detail. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here have done much damage. 7 ships against a kingdom that had ruled the richest port on the coast. That's all it took in the end. Not an army, not an empire. 7. We don't know the exact day the end came. No one wrote down a date for the last morning, because by the last morning there was no one left to write much of anything. But the clay tells us how it went. The scribes were still working. That's the detail that haunts the archaeologists. In the ruins of Ugarit, they found letters that had been written and stored and were waiting to be sent. Ordinary administrative business. The paperwork of a city that still expected a tomorrow. The bureaucracy was running right up to the last hour. Somewhere in that palace, men were still keeping the records straight while the smoke came in under the door. Around them, the city was full. Something like 10,000 people lived in Ugarit, a real crowded city by the standards of the age, packed with merchants and craftsmen and sailors and the enslaved. On an ordinary morning, the harbor would have been loud. Cargo coming off the ship, donkeys on the inland road, the smell of cooking and tar and salt. We don't know what the last ordinary morning felt like because nobody thought to write it down. There was no reason to. But we know the records kept being filed, which means that for most of those 10,000 people, right up until it wasn't, it was just another day. The end didn't announce itself. It arrived as ships on the horizon, and then it was simply there. And here is the image that the whole story is usually told around. In one of the ovens, the kiln where scribes baked their tablets hard, investigators found a batch of clay letters. The story you'll hear again and again is that these were the final messages of Ugarit, written, set in the oven to harden, and never collected, because the people who would have carried them were already dead or fleeing. Letters caught mid-sentence by the fire that ended the world. It's a beautiful, terrible image. The last words of a dying city, baked solid by the flames that killed it. I should be honest with you. Some historians aren't aren't sure that's really what happened. The oven might have been baking those tablets on a perfectly normal day for perfectly normal reasons, and the timing might be a story we tell ourselves because we want the ending to be poetic. We genuinely don't know. The clay won't say. It's one of those small mysteries the ground refuses to give up, and I'd rather leave it standing than pretend it's solved. What isn't a mystery is the fire. The archaeologists found it everywhere, a layer of destruction across the whole city, in places more than a meter thick, burned beam, collapsed wall. And the fires hadn't started in one corner and spread. They'd started in many places at once, all over the city, the way a fire starts when people are setting it on purpose. They found arrowheads in the ruins, spear point, the marks of close, ugly fighting in the streets. There's a quieter kind of evidence too, and it might be the saddest. All over the ruins, people had hidden things, small hoards of gold and bronze, buried under floors and pushed into gaps in the wall. The savings of families who clearly meant to come back for them once the danger had passed. They never came back. The hoards were still there 3,000 years later, sitting exactly where frightened hands had left them. Whoever buried that gold believed right to the end that there would be an afterward, that the storm would blow over and normal life would pick back up the way it always had before. It didn't. And then, in the layers above, they found nothing. No rebuilding. No new city rising on the ashes the way cities almost always do. Ugarit was burned and emptied and left. For something like 300 years, nobody came back. As one archaeologist put it, writing stops, everything stops, and no one returned. A port that had hummed with the trade of the whole known world simply went silent, and stayed silent for longer than the United States has existed. The 7 ships sailed away, and one of the great cities of the Bronze Age was over. So why didn't anyone stop it? It's the question every one of these stories comes back to. A rich, clever, well-defended city with a king who saw the danger coming and even wrote it down, and still it ended in an afternoon. How? The honest answer is that no one could stop it because there was nothing left to stop it with, and because everyone who might have helped was busy drowning too. Think about what had to be true for Ugarit to survive. It needed its army home, but the army was off propping up the Hittites because Ugarit couldn't afford to refuse. It needed its navy in its own harbor, but the navy had been sent away for the same reason. It needed grain in its store, but the grain was gone, eaten by years of drought. It needed allies who could send rescue, but the allies were starving or burning or had problems of their own that came first. Every single thing that made Ugarit strong was also a thread tying it to a system that was failing. The trade that made it rich was the trade that, once it stopped, left it with nothing to eat. The empire that protected it was the empire that stripped it bare. The connections that built it were the connections that pulled it down. That's the quiet lesson hiding in the clay. Ugarit didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it was woven so tightly into a bigger thing that when the bigger thing came apart, there was no version of Ugarit that survived on its own. It had stopped being able to stand alone a long time before the ships arrived. It just hadn't found out yet. The king saw the trap. He even named it. And naming it changed nothing at all, because here's what Ammurapi couldn't see from inside his burning palace. He wasn't watching the fall of a city. He was watching the fall of everything. Ugarit was not alone. Within roughly one human lifetime, across the whole eastern Mediterranean, the great powers went down almost together, like a row of houses sharing one wall. The Hittite Empire, the superpower that had been begging Ugarit for grain, collapsed. Its capital, a vast stone city called Hattusa, was abandoned and burned. Across the sea, the Mycenaean Greeks, the people of the great palaces, of the legends that would one day become the Trojan War, their palaces burned too, one after another, and the Greeks fell into a dark age so deep they forgot how to write for 400 years. City after city around the Mediterranean shows the same scar in the ground, a thick black layer of ash, dated to within a few decades of Ugarit, and above it, silence. The scale of it is hard to hold in your head. This wasn't one city, or 3. Across the eastern Mediterranean, something close to half of all the known cities were destroyed or simply abandoned in the span of a few decades. Writing systems vanished. The great palace economies, the ones that had counted every jar of oil and every head of sheep, stopped counting because there was no longer anything to count. The trade routes that had run for centuries went quiet. The bronze stopped flowing, and an entire way of living, connected, literate, international, the only world anyone alive had ever known, was switched off like a lamp. In some places, the lights would not come back on for 300 or 400 years. Only Egypt held on, and barely. The pharaoh Ramesses III carved an account of it into the walls of a temple, and his words have the tone of a man describing a flood. He wrote that the foreign lands had made a conspiracy among their island, that no country could stand before their weapon, that they came, and they burned, and they kept coming. He called them the Sea People, raiders out of the water, no one entirely sure who they were or where they came from. And that is the last and largest mystery of this whole story, the one historians have argued over for a century and still haven't put to rest. What actually did it? Was it the Sea Peoples sweeping through and burning everything? Was it the drought and the famine? Was it earthquakes? There's evidence of those too, a run of them. Was it the trade routes snapping so that the bronze stopped and the armies fell apart? Was it ordinary people starving, rising up against kings who couldn't feed them? The truthful answer is probably all of it at once. A world too tightly wound, hit by too many things at the same time, with no slack left anywhere to absorb the blow. Not one cause, a cascade, but we don't know, not really. 3,000 years later, we are still standing in the ash, holding the burned letters, trying to read the handwriting of a catastrophe. The Bronze Age didn't end with an explanation. It ended with a silence we've never fully been able to fill. There's one more thing, and it's the strangest part of all. In 1928, on that same Syrian coast, a farmer was plowing his field, and his plow caught on stone. Under the stone was a tomb. Under the tomb was a city no living person had thought about in 3,000 years. They'd forgotten the name. They'd forgotten it was ever there. What they dug out of the ground was the clay. Thousands of tablets, the letters, the accounts, the desperate last messages of a kingdom that burned, and among them, the alphabet. Those 30 little signs the scribes of Ugarit had pressed into wet clay, one sound at a time. The idea didn't die with the city. The alphabet, the radical, simple idea that you could write any word in the world with a small handful of signs, slipped out of that burning coast and survived. It traveled. Other people on that shore carried it across the sea. The Greeks reshaped it. The Romans reshaped it again, and it kept going, hand to hand, century to century, until it reached the letters on this screen, the letters in this sentence. So this is what's left of Ugarit, not the harbor, not the king, not the navy, or the gold, or the grain, or the 7 ships. The 10,000 people are nameless acts, but the alphabet they use to keep their accounts is the one we just used to tell you they ever existed at all. A city that vanished so completely the world forgot its name, and it handed us the very letters we'd need one day to remember it. The sea took Ugarit, 7 ships out of the water, and a 1,000-year world went dark. But the sea has always been like that. It's where empires reach for greatness, and it's where they're broken. The same water carrying the trade that builds them and the fleets that end them. Ugarit lost everything because its ships were in the wrong place. 7 centuries later, on that same Mediterranean, another ruler would put her own ships in exactly the right place and command a fleet into the largest sea battle the ancient world had ever seen. The only queen on the water that day, fighting for the greatest empire on earth, in a battle that would decide whether that empire lived or died. She gave her king advice no one else dared give him. He didn't take it. That story is next.